Good morning, good afternoon, and a warm welcome to all our attendees. My name is Ajay Agarwal, and I'll kick off the webinar today. Thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. The topic for today's discussion is CLM Maturity Spectrum, the journey to commercial value management. I am Ajay Agarwal, co-founder and chairman at Siri On Labs, and your host for today. Before we get started, here are a couple of housekeeping items. The webinar slides and the recording will be emailed to all of you after the webinar is over. If you have questions, and we encourage you to pose questions, please do so in the chat on the webinar panel available to you. Right, as we get started, a quick overview of the organizers. Spend Matters is the leading solution intelligence source for buy-side professionals in sourcing, contracting, procurement, supply chain finance, and contingent workforce management. A very respected industry analyst, and we're very glad to have them with us today. Unilever is a global leader in consumer goods, producing foods, beverages, cleaning agents, and personal care products. And Siri On Labs is transforming the contracting engagement between enterprises by bringing contracting parties closer together across the full life cycle of the contract, from contract creation to performance to closure. Over the next 60 minutes or so, we will be focusing on an integrated CLM maturity model framework that plots organizational maturity and digital maturity to maximize the commercial value residing in contracts. We will also take that abstract framework into a very real context of an organization like Unilever and explain through Gaurav's experience how Unilever has embraced digitization in contract management to overcome challenges in managing third parties. And we'll conclude by talking a little more futuristically about emerging CLM technologies that are focusing on sustainable enterprise value. A quick word on the participants today and our speakers. Gaurav Gupta is General Manager for Enterprise Technology Services at Unilever and heads their enterprise supplier strategy and performance monitoring. We're very, very pleased to have him with us today to talk generally about the topic, but also specifically about the changes that he's brought at Unilever. Pierre is one of the most respected analysts, comes to us from Spend Matters, where he is their Chief Research Officer and Managing Director. And he will be talking a little more generally and broadly about the maturity model today. And with that, I think we're going to get started. I'm going to now turn it over to Pierre to kick off the session today. Over to you, Pierre.
Thanks, Ajay, and thanks everybody for attending. I'm going to try to keep my session brief so that we can get over to Unilever and kind of see how it's actually working in the trenches. So I did want to set the stage though a little bit and kind of see who we are. If we can go to the next slide, having a little problem with my adjustment. Thank you. So if you this was a Deloitte CPO study, and I actually helped them author this for the 2019 version of it. And this was some 450 senior procurement executives responding to this. And really the theme of the report was business complexity, right? And if you kind of think about what that means in terms of those executives, obviously things like the downturn and the trade war and Brexit, that's kind of, front of mind. And all of these things, do have contractual implications. And so that if you want to see where you're exposed in terms of different, regs or the issues of Brexit, or you want to understand on trade war and tariffs, where my Incoterms getting affected, which of my relationships are going to be impacted. If you have really robust contract repository, you can be able to interrogate those types of details and such. But the biggest thing, in terms of 3 points that I want to highlight from the study was, one, the thing that was really quite interesting is their number 2 issue was actually not an outside-in issue of what's going on the market, but just the risk that their own internal complexity it creates from multiple organizational silos, siloed systems, lack of standardization, ongoing M&A activity, et cetera. So this, is one of the key factors for lower value creation and higher value leakage, which we'll touch on in a second. The other is kind of this. There is this issue around that was kind of interesting. How much it came to the top was, how do we deal with mega suppliers? So I don't want to call it a post-strategic sourcing world, but as we develop, really pick these big suppliers, those suppliers are usually pretty good at managing us better than we're managing them. So they have strategic account management, and we may have a little bit of that, on our side. That might be pockets of excellence in a IT VMO or in our maybe in our procurement organization. But there's an opportunity here to go for the CPO, not just to become the real CEO, as an example of Tim Cook, et cetera, at Apple, but also CEO meaning the chief externalization officer. And so while some companies might have chief digital officers around digitization, there's really not often a real single accountable executive that's really responsible for really strategic third-party management and really all the things that we externalize. How do we manage across those firewalls? A few organizations have it, but typically not. So strategically, how do we kind of manage that, especially when the data underneath is really so complex and there is no more foundational system of record than contract. I was just talking to a client in the healthcare industry, and she was mentioning that there was 28 separate people, that are kind of accessing, different parts of the contract. So if you're going to if we go to the next slide, if you kind of think about as we move to this kind of everything as a service, world where everything is services, even manufacturing, manufacturing services, logistics services. Those services, basically, and as those services move from labor-based to increasingly digital-based, you have to be really good at managing cloud contracts, outsourcing contracts, MSPs, the whole, gambit. And that key system of record that is, and really system of value, that commercial system value is the contract, right? So if you're going to create joint value with your suppliers through good collaborative contracting, and if you're going to then protect the value, in other words, minimize value leakage, you have to have that ability to kind of manage these services and the spend. And value, the easiest way to think of value is bang for the buck. So the more bang you can get from your services, better outcomes from those services. That's tremendous. And obviously you want to minimize, the spend and minimize value leakage. So let's go to the next slide. So as part of that, we have kind of a three-tier kind of model in which we kind of look at what's going on from kind of basic contract lifecycle management, which is foundational. You need to, get your repository in place, be able to manage your clause library, be able to have good authoring processes, cross-functional authoring, good, digital signatures, some basic, and get some basic compliance in place. That's great. That's kind of like a hygiene level to kind of really be able to kind of get to the next level, which is not so much about managing the life cycle of the contract, but managing around the life cycle of the commercial relationship. So this is source to pay, order to cash, CPQ, configure price quote, hire to retire, where you plug in some contingent, workforce management, et cetera, right? So that commercial area around commerce really starts to talk not so much about just contracting process efficiency or some of the basic kind of risk reduction, but actually improving outcomes of our spend process. So sourcing better with contracts up front, much better and deeper compliance to prevent value leakage on the back end on the P2P side, but also then moving into more strategic third-party performance management. And if you can really manage that well, now you kind of shift from what you see on the right and this is from IACCM, which is the Contract and Commercial Management Association. You go from this kind of risk-centric kind of set of terms, and this is their most negotiated terms, study they do every year. You move from the things in red to really the much more commercially focused, how do we win together with our counterparties? And if we do that well, now we can start to get into the more interesting areas around, innovation, around more end-to-end supply chain. How do we link our customer, facing processes on CPQ, over to the buy side? How do we go across multiple tiers? You really start getting into much more, how do we really enable the business? And if you can do that, you can kind of create a lot of value. And ICCM has done a lot of benchmarking in this area around, value erosion, and this area around, value leakage. And they put it at about 9% of revenue. Obviously, your results will vary, but that's a pretty big number just for the value erosion side. And so I think this is where Unilever and Ajay will talk about it more from the Siri On side. So okay, let's move to the next slide. So as part of this overall value proposition, one of the things, and I know this is a bit of a complicated chart, but I think it's really important to drive home how critical contract information is to all of the stakeholders in the business. So regardless of whether it's source to pay, supplier management, order to cash, if it's in marketing, attract to engage, whether it's on the finance side and their process, capital risk management, whether it's on the services side, on the IT side, right, in terms of vendor management, services management. All of these processes are going to have some level of contract and commercial data embedded within them. And the challenge is that each of those systems might have a little bit of contract information in them, but they're not really deep, robust modeling that really captures kind of the value that you're trying to drive and manage with your counterparty. So these kind of next generation CLM systems are really providing a much deeper and richer set of ways in which you model the value elements, the commercial value elements, the relationship, the risks associated with those, relationships, and also getting into really granular process management. So as you take your processes, which are basically, think of services as like a process with an SLA. If you kind of take your internal processes and externalize those more and more, and you want to manage both internal and external, you've got to be able to manage really deep kind of, service level agreements to manage those services themselves. And that requires much more than what your typical back-end systems are going to have, which are very, especially like ERP and some of the source-to-pay systems that are very much kind of SKU product, very, very simplistic rate card kind of orientation. So the key is put in the contract not just to support some of these basic core processes and they kind of work better with legal to manage this process, but really to drive deeper into those deals, and also design your contracts for execution. Just like you design products for, manufacturability, you want to design your contracts for being able to support the back-end processes to execute against that. Because right now, the invoicing and reconciliation process is really a disaster. The more complicated the relationships that you have with logistics service providers or BPOs or whatever, the more in which you're going to have a value leakage problem on the back end. So, all right, let's kind of go to the next slide, and I'm going to kind of wrap up here. So this, from a process standpoint, one of the things that's really important to just think about in this better contract management is not just, managing contracts at a certain point in time. Let's say after we've sent an NDA to a potential supplier, we do a sourcing process, we've gone through the deal, and oh, by the way, now we're going to get to the real contract that needs to be signed. And suddenly you're introducing a set of things that maybe the supplier, is assuming that maybe you'd handle versus them. And it really just, it draws out then the process for sourcing, or on the sell side, it will actually, you can potentially lose a deal if you start getting into those protracted negotiations because you didn't consider them real time upfront and have that kind of seamlessly tied into the process. So this is where you get a lot of these handoffs and rework and errors and, et cetera. So the better way, if you go to the next slide, is kind of having this much richer set of contract data that is really served up much more seamlessly into the actual sourcing process, and really in a way that you actually can kind of guide the sourcing and guide the contracting process right from the get-go up front. So this notion of guided contracting, guided sourcing, to really make sure you're driving best practice up front to then set the types of things, the processes that you want to use to engage with the counterparties, the best practices you bring to bear, and then the type of data that you want to bring to bear. So by tying this in right from the get-go, you're going to minimize rework, minimize value leakage, and especially when you bring this over into execution onto the P2P side, you're going to make sure that when the moment of truth happens, when you start actually getting an invoice from the suppliers, you're going to be able to tie that natively right into this richer system of record, through this increasingly automated kind of reconciliation where you can kind of fail safe that and minimize the leakage. So, with that, I'm gonna the next 3 slides I'm gonna kind of just let you guys will get as handouts, after the webinar. But this is kind of a little, a very simplified kind of maturity model. We have a more robust one, but I think this is kind of good enough for webinar purposes, in terms of as we look at basic, intermediate, and kind of advanced contract management, where we go from a very deal-centric risk transfer kind of document management approach to then more of where most progressive organizations are, which is focused on the overall process, source to pay, configure, price, quote. How do we really use the contract, to kind of make those sourcing outcomes better, but also on the execution and ongoing relationship management? How do we just make sure that we're focusing on our time on the things that really matter, which is the strategic management pieces, and not how do we tick and tie, the granular invoices that are coming in, weekly, biweekly, monthly, et cetera. And then for where the future is, this is going to be the advanced commercial value management, and that is going much deeper, into how do we model these commercial elements, how do we might get better at modeling risk around these very areas, how do we put costs associated with these risks to treat the risks, and then how do we get into much more category-specific, industry-specific kind of intelligence, where we're not just kind of moving documents and forms and such, but actually how do we get some collective intelligence from all of the users and the businesses out there, not just in terms of low-level AI around contract analytics and parsing out some metadata, out of your historical contract documents, but how do we start driving some more kind of collective intelligence into the process, so that let's say you get a counterparty paper from Microsoft or someone else, and you immediately, the system can, the bots, the AI can then kind of say, right, I know what it is, I know what to do with this, I know what we've done, how we've negotiated this before. I can now start to serve up very specific sets of decision support analytics that can kind of help you, manage that much more powerfully than you could before. If you do that, you're really going to kind of make yourself and your cross-functional teams, much more powerful in terms of, being able to move up the value stack. And that's ultimately what everybody's trying to do. You got to stay one step ahead of the algorithm, and generate value. So anyway, with that, I know it was a bit of a flyby. We'll have time, hopefully, in Q&A to kind of get at some follow-up questions. But I would like to get this back over to Ajay to get this, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Unilever case study. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Pierre. And I'd like to introduce our other panelists today, Gaurav Gupta from Unilever. And Gaurav will now talk a little more about the journey at Unilever.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. I hope you are able to hear me. I just want to start off with a slight background around Unilever. I don't need to get into the depths of it, but everyone knows Unilever, a consumer goods giant, which is available and is present in every country of the world. What it means from a contract management perspective is most of our contracts end up being big global contracts. We can move on. Yeah. From a supply chain perspective, and just again, I'm not going to get into too much of details around the numbers, but these are all the informations that are there in the public domain. We as a company are a huge buying entity, and ends up we end up having procurements and sourcing across multiple categories, and spend cutting across various domains, which means the systems and the backbone that we have for managing our contracts and managing the diversity of our partners, as well as the complex relationship cutting across various categories, it creates a unique challenge in terms of being able to manage the whole ecosystem seamlessly. Next one. Thanks. Now, from a supplier strategy and performance perspective, this whole organization was put in place a couple of years back when we thought that we need to have a very very strategic as well as extremely structural approach towards managing our partners ground up. We have, as I mentioned, we are present in every country, so it only makes sense to have a global business services organization which serves, for IT, for finance, for HR, for workplace, various kinds of needs. A kind of a global template to all the countries, which can then be followed through global processes, right? And obviously, there's always a global versus local sort of balance that has to be maintained for our organization to be able to be agile, as well as have the supplier ecosystem which is functioning and scaling globally, as well as is effective locally. For us to be able to deliver that global business services organization, we felt that having a clear supplier strategy and performance is extremely important, and have that kind of framework which spans across the 180 plus countries, but is able to align all the suppliers in a way which synchronize their movements, which also helps us gain the value, which also helps us to have standardized ways of contract management. That would unlock a huge amount of not just the savings, but the overall value and innovation through our partners. And that was the whole reason why this whole organization was set to sort of drive these agendas. And now, if you look at what key performance pillars that we look into, it's obviously the contract compliance and management for the contracts that are driven through the shared services. This organization is also driving the contract change management. It's driving the performance of the contracts, which includes financial performance, commercial performance, the operational performance. Clearly, the commercial management part, whether it is forecasting, whether it is to do with the third-party spend analytics, so on and so forth. I mean, having the entire billing done seamlessly, that becomes core part of commercial management. The overall governance of the suppliers, whether it is strategic, operational, or tactical, there is a framework that is defined, and the strategic and tactical governances are owned by this group. And the overall overarching strategy for our suppliers: who's the valued supplier, who's the strategic supplier, which suppliers do we want to re-inspect, which suppliers do we want to scale, the overall transformation model across suppliers, whether it is rationalization of suppliers or it is proliferation of startups. That strategy is then baked into the overall framework. So these are the key pillars through which we drive the overall supplier efficiency. Now, obviously, as we talk about an organization, just sort of the scale and size of Unilever, there are challenges involved. The challenges span from challenges related to transparency to deeper challenges, which is more structural in terms of the fact that on one hand, Unilever buys palm oil and soaps and what you have, the raw materials for all those SKUs, to the other extreme where we are putting up our data centers, and we are putting our data scientists together, and we have suppliers for so many categories. So the billing structures come out to be extremely complex, and to be able to handle some of those billing structures, you have to have multitude of tools, processes, so on and so forth, a number of areas where you can completely get fragmented as an organization. So these challenges, I'm sure, are there with every company in different shapes and forms and impact and magnitude, but you will be able to relate to some of these which we have encountered in the last couple of years when we started on this journey. Let's move on. So with that background, we took a few initiatives, and we said that with that complex sort of ecosystem of our partners, having global business services being an anchor towards the overall supplier steering, how do we drive the end-to-end contract management in a way wherein it is no touch, and try and see if we can make automation as the driver for standardization as well as overall improvement of our supplier intelligence and efficiency. Right? And can we do it at a scale? Can we cut it across categories? Can we do it in a way which is non-intrusive to the overall operational performance? So obviously, some of the key mandates that had to be finally unlocked and sort of sort of sponsored for this kind of an initiative required right from the top, the CIO, CFO, service line leaderships, so on and so forth, to kind of completely agree in principle that this is what we want to do. These are the areas we want to focus, and I think a lot of top-down approach helped in terms of bringing the whole idea of no-touch contract management to life, because some of these ideas, and specifically on the back of the wave that we are having in terms of automation, digitization, and so on and so forth, everyone is talking about digital. So to really bring the whole thing into life and show the value that we are envisaging out of it, you don't want to be one of many, and hence it's important that no touch contract management as an initiative is driven at the highest of the levels with a clear end goal and business benefit in the site. We went through some tool selection processes. We ended up leveraging Siri On's contract management tool. One of the key, sort of decision factors was primarily to have the entire chain of contract management, as well as performance management, as well as billing management, and then the whole governance piece integrated across one platform, so that there is an interoperability across these initiatives as well as interventions. And that was the key crucial factor, which sort of gave us a lot of relief in terms of handling some of the program complexities, right? Whether it was related to the complex contracts not talking to each other because of the various billing and governance mechanism, whether it was the varying maturity of the suppliers, and obviously, which is also linked to the level of documentation that we have in terms of our core processes. But once you have an end-to-end system which helps you put a change in billing, talk to a change in governance, to talk to a change in contract change management, talk to the overall strategic interventions, you will be able to cut across some of these complexities in a very standardized way, which helps you to drive the entire engine forward. The key, as I mentioned, is because this initiative has to be at a high visibility level, the results have to be produced pretty quickly. You can't just wait for 3-year-long implementation to be able to say that you will be able to automate and digitize a few contracts and that will unlock some savings. You will have to have a clear business case which unlocks savings in a very, very quick manner. We can move on to the next one. And so for us to be able to deliver that, we went for an approach where we looked at all the key sort of functions, whether it was finance services, IT, HR services, workplace services. We looked at the supplier ecosystem there. You would appreciate that the contract of a Sodexo strokes, real estate partner would be very different from a contract of a Capgemini handling your data center. And a logistics provider like DHL providing order to cash and logistics services. So if you have that kind of a complexity, how do you activate some of these things and deliver quick results? The trick was to be able to go process by process. So we activated contract change management across all the functions, and we were able to then immediately switch on a governance module which was able to connect with the contract change management, which helped us to quickly capture what was discussed in various governances and validate was it getting captured across the contract changes across various kinds of contracts. So some of these live examples really helped and unlocked fair amount of savings, and then that became the proof of the pudding in terms of really showcasing the value of this program. Some of the data points are very clear in front of the slides and in the slides, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but it just shows the scale and size of the overall program and the level of change that we've been able to push through. Next. The next couple of slides are primarily the benefits that we've received as part of the overall Siri implementation. And I think we are still at an early stage because we've just gone through the implementation, but some of the clear winners that are coming out are a large part of the shared services was involved in doing a very tactical stuff of managing purchase orders, managing the invoices, accruals, validating the bills, and all the service lines were spending considerable amount of bandwidth in doing so. By putting an automated platform where you have automated billing, you have automated contract change, it just relieves the service line from all these low-lying activities. It can be done by procurement in some companies, in some companies it is done by legal, in some companies it is done by the service lines, or wherever there is that whole tactical bit of work, it really gets eliminated. We've seen it happening amongst some of the other benefits. Clearly, every information is real time. There was a time when I could not answer how many SOWs, how many RFPs are going across in my shared services organization. By putting everything onto one platform, it just creates that level of data which is so incisive in terms of driving value, in terms of providing visibility, in terms of really putting some direction to your actions, and that really unlocks a lot of value. Clearly, it gives you a sense of scale. We realized that we have a huge tail of suppliers, which could have been easily ignored because those onesies and twosies of SOWs are never ever looked at, never categorized, never recorded, and no one bothers about it. But the moment you have a platform which is capturing everything, gives you an ocean of data to categorize and then attack your supplier consolidation programs, help you with billing validation programs, helps you with invoice validation programs, and so on and so forth. And each bit of it unlocks a fair bit of value. We can go on to the next. Yeah. I talked about billing validation, and I think this is another piece that along with Siri On leadership, Unilever leadership worked on, which is primarily how we handle the close to 2-3 million sort of invoices that we get almost every month across our various categories, and a part we said that we will start automating some part of billing validation through shared services, and a part of that has been now achieved where from a place where we didn't know how many contracts existed, from how many SOWs existed, and thereby what should be the charge from the partner. There was some high level validation from the service line, but there were always leakages, to a place where today we are going to our partners and saying, look, this is what you should be billing me because this is the price, this is the consumption unit that you be used. A lot of our contracts are now turning into consumption-based contracts, outcome-based contracts. We've been able to validate bills and then proactively tell our partners that this is what you should be billing. And we've observed that in the last 3 to 4 months that we've started doing that, the number of disputes have gone down significantly. More often than not, we had disputes wherein we were asking for money back. It might just be the cycle, or it might just be the bad behavior. But at the end of the day, we realize that the moment we get control of what we are consuming versus what we are spending, we were able to tell the supplier very objectively that this is what you should be charging us, and that reduced the number of disputes, that reduced the number of governances, the level of rework that came along with all the billing validation exercises, and we've been able to unlock significant amount of savings as value gap or value leakage gap analysis, as well as plugging of those gaps. So this is one of the examples in terms of really bringing it to life, how one of your interconnected yet end-to-end platform initiatives can really drive some quantifiable savings. Next, please. I think I've talked about some of the benefits earlier. The only other thing that I would talk about is um, the 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 real value of this initiative really came to light when we started looking at the automated dashboards, wherein we were able to, because we were able to predict the bills, we were able to talk about what we will be consuming, and that led to a lot of insights towards how we drive our capital efficiency. And typically, you have an OPEX and CAPEX model um, in every company, and there is a good amount of information which basically drives those decision making events, and a lot of information for that event today comes from this database that has come out, wherein we are able to predict what we are going to be consuming, where we need to be investing, and how much of a capital do we need to drive, what level of efficiency are we looking at, what kind of savings can we deploy from trade or OPEX and can move into CAPEX. So there's a lot of finance sort of support that is getting generated, which is actually surprising, because when we started this whole initiative, we were thinking that it'll be helping more of sourcing and legal. And as we are getting into the value creation mode, we are seeing that a lot of requests are actually coming from CFO's office, and it's actually supporting a lot of CFO agenda, along with obviously the sourcing as well as the compliance part, which is coming from the legal analytics perspective as well. Let's move on. And this example of spend forecasting, just conscious that we have little time, so I'll just rush through it. Is a case in point to what I just mentioned a couple of minutes back. So as we started getting more and more command, and as we move towards an automated, more accurate, more value creative platform towards contracts with 1.2 billion odd spend running through it, it also helps the CFO of the organization to actually ask the third party spend from one organization which has it from so much of a with so much of a detail, and you have both actuals segregated in a way wherein you can actually start predicting the forecasts for the next year for your service line. So over a period of time, we've actually become part of the Unilever cash up system, Unilever forecasting systems, and Unilever actuals realization systems, which are related to the month end closing, which are related to the overall financial planning. And today, any third party spend forecast is sought from two parties. One is this organization, the other is the actual service line. And there is a variance analysis which is done from both the data sets, and you would observe that when you start doing multi-pronged data analysis on spend forecasting, then obviously there are efficiencies to be had, and there are good questions and challenges that can be thrown back at the service lines in terms of their spend patterns and so on and so forth. So this is another case in point in terms of how value of data collected through an automated platform with an interoperable function can help you create value, not just in terms of savings, but in terms of real tangible process improvements that are recognized at the highest of the levels. Can Go to the next. And the next, I think we've covered this. Right. So just sort of concluding my sort of experience around this journey. Um, Clearly, there are some basic expectations one can have when we are going on to this journey. This is a transformation journey. This is a digital journey. This is a process improvement journey. This is a value unlock journey. So you would expect, a lot of pushback in terms of why, and then you would have a number of answers to give when you go back and say this is why, right? But then one should always consider that, and then some of those answers will be, you will have to align your stakeholders. Some of those answers, for some of those answers, you will have to have the right data of the right quality just to prove that it really works. You will have to manage some expectations that things are not going to get turned on quickly. It requires a lot of governance as well as collaboration from everyone around. Um, and it doesn't come without customization. I mean, I think when it comes to a critical process like this, there is no tool in the market that is off the shelf and you can plug and play. Every company has its own rhythm in terms of you know and this is really where the competitive advantage comes into the picture. So you may want to look at some of your sourcing processes, legal processes, which are extremely confidential, and financial processes, and some of those are going to get onboarded onto this system. So if there are some customizations, and please keep your organizations be aware and expecting that. What is important is there are new horizons like the whole automated vendor onboarding, because as you grow into this platform, your contracts will keep changing, your suppliers will keep changing, and you don't really want to spend that level of effort in terms of onboarding the vendors onto this platform every time. So the whole reusability of templates is something that becomes extremely important, and the fact that you will have real-time data-driven dashboards. Please don't be surprised if you are getting surprise calls from senior leadership about completely new uses for data. I mean, you will get pulled into a number of these high high visibility calls, clear decision making calls, where some of the data which is coming out of the contractual database is going to be super critical, and it's going to be the most authentic and honest view of the world from a lot of perspective. So I think this primarily summarizes our journey, our experience, and what has really happened within Unilever and how we are approaching it. Look forward to any questions that you may have in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaurav. That really was a fascinating journey through the boiler room at Unilever, and time permitting, will focus some questions your way towards the end of this webinar. So this is Ajay. I'm back again, and I'll talk very quickly about some of what we've heard and some of the technology journey that we've been seeing from our perspective here at Siri On Labs. A quick couple of words about Siri On. Recently featured as one of the top CLM providers in the Spend Matters industry solution map. And as you can see, we're featured here as a value leader, both by the customer and by the analyst scores. Thank you so much, DJ. And the company's journey really, I think, enables us, if we can move to the next slide, the company's journey from a technology perspective really connects a lot of what we've been hearing from Pierre and from Gaurav over the last 40 minutes. And it's about understanding historically what prevented CLM from realizing its full potential. And I think to cut to the chase, whether you think of it in terms of contracting maturity model, as Pierre puts it, or you think about it in terms of realizing the value, as Gaurav puts it, of the contract. Either way, it's connecting the dots between the CLM and the underlying organizational technology backbone, whether that's the P2P backbone side, or it's the ERP and ultimately the CRM backbone on the sell side. It's about connecting the dot between the contract and the business value that was intended to transfer. And the more we think of a contract as an isolated repository or an isolated authoring, negotiation, and repository, and leave other in the business to connect those dots, extracting the information, and by layering on the business processes, as Gaurav mentioned, the less likely we are to help contracting process realize its value. So this slide here really shows in a kind of an X-ray type of formation a lot of those underlying business functions that are sitting adjacent to the larging contracting process, right? On the left-hand side, we can see, let's say on the sourcing side, the procurement department spending 6 to 12 months on these large strategic projects. And then on the right-hand side, we can see how legal, commercial work together with their counterparts in business, and on the risk and the finance side to monitor various aspects of those engagements from a post-signature perspective. And I think the point that both Pierre and Gaurav have been at pains to emphasize is about connecting the pre-contracting phase, the CLM component, with the post-signature trajectory, and being able to map the data sitting inside the contract to the data that's emerging on the post-signature side, whether it's performance data or it's invoice data, and thereby connect those dots. So the idea of a CLM repository that is integrated seamlessly with the post-signature functional systems, whether they are service management, risk management, generation systems, that I think, in my opinion, holds the key to realizing the fuller potential of CLM or the increased maturity of the CLM model. If we can go to the next slide, we'll be able to see this visualized as a journey of maturity, going from creating the contract to analyzing the content and the data inside the contract. And once we have a handle on that, then move towards operationalizing that contract. So looking at the performance dimension, the obligations, the what, the how, the service levels, the KPIs, and ultimately, of course, the invoices, and being able to do predictive invoicing, to do smart invoicing. And last but not least, in my opinion, too much of contracting inherits the us versus them mentality, the adversarial mentality that's inherited from the early stage of contract negotiation. I think it's very important that CLM, as part of the maturity curve of CLM, efface that adversarial mentality and move more towards a collaborative mentality. And I think one of the biggest points in the Unilever journey that Gaurav spoke of for me is getting the alignment with the suppliers on the what and the how, and what exactly happened in terms of data. So call that collaboration, or call that working off the same set of data. But the idea of technology should not be to harden the us versus them, your data versus my data, but to create rather a common source of data. So I think for me, when I think of Pierre's journey of maturity, for me, it's about extending the original relatively limited vision for CLM from creation by layering on the artificial intelligence involved in analyzing these contracts and the legacy contracts, but then moving past both of those into the operational and the collaboration side of things. Thank you, DJ. If you can, yes. So this slide is yet another representation of that same functional curve, right? Whether we talk about authoring or contract data extraction and management, on to tracking the performance, whether it's obligations or service levels, tracking the invoices, enabling the collaboration, and ultimately being able to do so in such a way that we're able to analyze all of this on a common framework, which forms the basis for collaboration. Thank you, DJ. We can move to the next slide. Thank you, DJ. So this is a quick series of snapshots. I thought that since so much of today's conversation has been so abstract, I'd give you a couple of glimpses into the platform and what some of these things might look like in practice, so you can experience more the journey that Unilever has gone through and the maturity curve that Pierre spoke of. On this page, you're seeing here what a futuristic system for creating contracts might be, where the smart data is being auto-tagged and being capable of being operationalized from the get-go by the use of smart tags. When we go to the next slide, you're able to see how the same smart tag data. You can go to the next.
Ajay, I'm on the next slide. I think we are having some issues hearing you now.
Okay, can we go to the next slide? Yeah, thank you. If you can hear me clearly now, yeah. So the same smart data that we created now can enable us to create a hierarchical repository. The hierarchical repository allows us not only to share data with the people who need to see that particular type of data, but also to create a functional footprint that contains appropriate functionality for the type of contract. So you don't want to necessarily use the full functionality of the platform for every supplier or every customer relationship, and the ability to be able to define hierarchical tiers where you're applying different levels of functionality to appropriate tiers is a very important part of this functional curve. If we move to the next slide. And then again, being able to connect the dots and see, collect the data, if you will, from service request systems, from project management systems, and from other sources of performance, and to be able to compute the service levels that are inscribed in the contract on a real-time basis. This, I think, is yet another element of connecting those dots with vendor performance. Next slide. And ultimately tying it all together and being able to then not only predict the invoice, but to automatically validate any incoming invoice from the vendor. So this is where all the dots come together: what was in the contract, what actually happened, what was consumed during the billable interval, and then being able to predict the invoice and automatically audit it. And I think this, in a sense, completes that journey that Gaurav spoke of, right? Because when the spend is of a simple nature, the price is in the contract, the quantity is in the purchase order, P times Q, life tends to be relatively simple, and older generation technologies, Ariba, Coupa, ERP systems, etc., are more than sufficient to validate those invoices and carry on. But as we all know, our spend has become more and more complex over the last 15 and maybe even more over the last 10 years. And this means that P times Q validation engines are not really going to be able to address a vast chunk of our third-party spend. And this is where engines that respect the underlying complexity of the pricing schema and the performance architecture of the contract and are able to track the actual performance and the actual consumption during that period and tackle such invoices automatically, these are increasingly going to become the technologies of the future, which keep pace with the contracting complexity of our current arrangements. Thank you, DJ. And last but not least, a visualization of how this data can generate actionable insights and allow us to share them between the two parties so that both parties are looking at a common view of the data, whether it's service levels, whether it's spend by category or performance by geography or overdue obligations, to be able to have this data available on both sides of the buyer-supplier spectrum and be able to orchestrate behavior in response to such data, I think is the ultimate sophistication. So with that, I'll pause here. We have 5 minutes. Love to open it up for questions, both for Pierre and for Gaurav. And I'll ask my colleague DJ to read out questions that have been coming in through the panel. Over to you, DJ.
Thank you, Ajay. So I do have a few questions. Keeping the time in mind, I'll get started quickly. The first question is for Gaurav. Gaurav, if you would like to answer this one. How did Unilever build a business case for this journey? And what were the key ROI elements that helped fund the solution?
Okay. So actually, it's especially I've worked on a number of organizational changes before. Frankly, this was the easiest of the business cases because you know that the whole implementation is being done to ultimately find value leakages and plug the gaps, right? So the art was to be able to identify a spend, create a POC. We took a spend of close to, I think, 100 and 200 million, and then said, if we implement a tool, something like that, how much of a saving can it realize? And then we did a 6 months POC, created a proof of concept value report, and then that got extended across the overall spend of 1.3 billion. And the investment for a team and the tool around that is not really that much, right? So clearly it was one of the easiest things to crack when it comes to the business case. The question is, and then the only challenge you would find is how do you showcase, your savings as not just one-time recovery, but an year-on-year or a regular reduction in your spend, right? And that is the usual challenge that you get from business case perspective. Most of the value gap items from a non-compliance perspective are recovery oriented, while what you get as part of invoice validation, billing validation, credit notes, so on and so forth, end up being repetitive. So these are the two elements that you need to keep in mind while creating the business case.
Thank you, Gaurav. The next question, maybe Ajay, you can take this one. So the question is, how are other companies that aren't Unilever's size and sophistication getting started on this journey?
Yeah, great question. And I think there are so many different parts at which to get it on the journey. I would say the most important part is getting all the contracts into a uniform repository and then being able to extract the data, operational data, financial data, pricing data, outcome data from those contracts and be able to track those expected outcomes in a uniform manner. That's a very common starting point. And then I guess starting to tier the contracts in such a way that prioritizes the strategic suppliers is probably another critical point, whether we do that on a perceived criticality or tiering of the suppliers, or we do it on a categorical basis, going from IT to BPO to facilities. These are all individual organizational choices. But yeah, certainly we've seen that companies that are slightly smaller tend to focus more on the front end of authoring and of repository and obligation management before turning their attention to deeper issues of performance management and invoice tracking.
Thank you, Ajay. I'll quickly squeeze in one last one for Pierre. Pierre, do you see tools like Siri On increasingly becoming the system of record due to their ability to manage service levels and invoices more granularly than ERP and source-to-pay systems?
Yeah, I mean that is the case. I mean, you can see little pieces of it in terms of like if you look at pricing optimization engines and B2C, where old CRM tools couldn't handle it. On the B2B side, this ability to kind of model very deep contracts is absolutely crucial. But it hasn't really kind of taken hold quite yet, and I think that's a real opportunity, you know. So right now, let's just look at where companies, you know, how they do this right now, right? In AP, if it's not, as Ajay said, you know, P times Q, how are they doing it? They're going to have to pass it back to the business. We're going to have to be able to go into these complex spreadsheets, maybe that we've modeled some of these things. The supplier has their own view. This ability to really model those service levels and tying it into those source systems like in IT management and things like that, you know, to really build that up front, really then allows you to do something like a contract flip, right, where you can actually present that, you know, to the supplier, and then they kind of, you know, sign off on it, and it's based on a joint, you know, development of this single system of record around these commercial elements. It's very powerful, and it's something that, you know, there's going to be a lot of integration in terms of some of the plumbing that you hook up for some of the you know, the data feeds and things. But in terms of like the AP integration, and, you know, it's relatively straightforward to say, great, if we're not doing it ourselves within our very limited systems, and there's only so much you can do with these ERP systems and the source to pay systems. You know, you can bolt on a flex field, you can do a little bit here and there, but they're really not going to get into those really sophisticated kind of pricing engines around service levels. So this is why there is this increasing need more and more. And I think folks like Unilever, anyone that's trying to get some back office scale, they might start easy around AP and supplier master, vendor master management, but really it's the contract data that's going to really enable not just that back end, you know, scale, but also on the front end. Because, by the way, that ability to do spend planning with the contracts and tying that into your FP&A process within finance, that's really huge. I've really been looking for a really good best practice, you know, case study example for companies that can kind of tie that down to the contract level, and here it is. So anyway, long answer to a short question.
Thank you, Pierre. And now we're absolutely out of time. I would like to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar, and I would like to thank our panelists for such an insightful discussion. Next steps, please do complete a brief survey at the end of this webinar once it closes, and we'll send you the email with the webinar recording and a copy of the slides, and we invite you to join us for more such events in the future. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.